Today we're going to be working on a Damascus slicer. It's not quite a Sujihiki because the design is a little bit different with the curved spine and stuff. I'm grinding here just to get off the decarb and to see the pattern. I use a push stick because I'm able to pinpoint the pressure exactly where I want it, and I'm able to put a lot of force into it. So once I get all the decarb off and I get the geometry relatively flat, I do a quick dip in ferric chloride to etch the pattern. After the dip, I just wash it really quick, dust some silicon carbide powder on there, and then give it a quick rub down to show some contrast. It looks pretty good to me, no major red flags. The pattern's a little bit different than I expected. I was hoping for something a little bit less bold initially, but I'm really good at playing within a box, and I think I enjoy it more than just a plain blank slate. So after I do that test etch and get the grind roughly where I want it, I sharpen the blade right now. It sounds weird because it kind of is. Usually most people would sharpen much closer towards the end. So why do I sharpen it so early? Because there was a certain point in rough grinding where it just gets really hard to tell where the actual edge is and how close I'm getting to it. At those early stages, it's just super hard to see and really hard to feel where zero is. Zero meaning like the zero thickness of the edge. So for me, when I sharpen this early, I'm eliminating the guesswork. I'm creating a really shallow bevel there. It's the same angle that I sharpen the knife when it's all done. And then it's much easier to see when I'm thinning down everything to that edge. I do a lot of the bulk thinning on the grinder. It's risky. It's easily to really mess things up. But if you do it right and you have the muscle memory for it, it can save a lot of time and a lot of abrasives. I don't use the push stick at this point. Stuff that needs a lot of finesse. I like to be able to just hold the knife freely in my hand and be able to rotate it and stuff like that. I also like to hold it diagonally on the platen to get more surface area in contact. So this gives it more stability. It's less aggressive when taking off material, but it's just more steady. So I get it pretty close, like almost to zero right there. And then I go back on the disc. And now with the geometry pretty much where I want it, it's time to clean up all the flats and get them actually flat, because on the grinder they're not going to be flat. So here I've got a carbide fixture clamped onto the blade, and I just run the flat right up to the edge of the disc, and that's what creates my plunge. On the disc grinder, I can swap out all the sandpaper and bring it to a high grit, and we take it pretty much all the way to the finishing grit that we start hand sanding at, so that's nice and efficient. Once I get the flat established and get it ready for hand sanding, then I take off this carbide jig and I start focusing on the bevel towards the edge. So here I'm just finding all the high spots, knocking them down. Be careful not to slip and grind your finger. And I'm just being really careful at this stage, especially running it a little bit quicker. It can be pretty dangerous if something does catch. So on this slicer, I'm going for a certain look. I want a pretty crisp bevel all the way down. I mean, basically like having a shinogi line on there, where you have the ridge of the grind all the way down the blade. The belt grinder isn't flat at all. The disc grinder is pretty flat, much flatter than the belt grinder, but it's still not like flat. The stone is pretty much as good as it gets. So I'm just taking the bevel that I established on the disc and working it by hand on the stones. So why stones here instead of like sandpaper or something? Well, sandpaper on the disc, on a sanding fixture, on holding it by hand or whatever, it just conforms a little bit. It washes out all the nice lines and stuff. So the stone is just a much better way to get really, really crisp facets. Here I'm bringing it all the way to 6,000 grit so that when hand sanding, we have to do the minimal amount of work, because the more hand sanding that you do, the more you're just going to wash it out. That's just how it is. So to keep the lines as crisp as possible, we do most of it on the stones and then do just the bare minimum with sandpaper. So here Sam is hand sanding the blade after it's been stoned. We're just getting all the scratches in a parallel orientation so that when we go to start etching it, you don't have any diagonal scratches showing up in some of the bold areas. After it's been hand sanded and the finish looks good enough, I go ahead and sign the blade. I'm electro etching it here with a stencil and using electrolyte and my homemade etcher. It runs pretty hot and I have to be careful not to burn the stencils or like get a lot of like ghosting around the edges of the signature. So I just do really quick dips. After everything's cleaned, after the signature is etched, I dip it in the ferric chloride. And sadly, there is some smudge or something, and it's really obvious. So I take it out, clean it, baking soda, bring it back and make sure it's actually clean this time. I'll leave it in the ferric for a few minutes, come back, make sure it looks good. And once it looks good, I put it in baking soda water. This neutralizes it, and then we clean it up again and do the process over and over until we get the contrast where I want it. So while working on the blade, I've been brainstorming handle ideas, and I wasn't really sure where I wanted to go with it. The bold design, the bold pattern on the Damascus kind of threw me for a loop, and I wasn't sure what handle material would look good with it, what kind of handle shape would look good. There's a reason why it kind of sat on the bench for so long, is because I just didn't know. So here I'm just looking at two different pieces that I thought could look good with this. One was snake wood. It's classy, it's got good activity, but it just didn't look right. And I have this one piece of Yellow Cedar Burl that was gifted to me from Luke of Owl Woodworks. It's a beautiful piece of wood. I saved it for a long time because it, just like this blade, I was waiting for like the right moment, and I wasn't actually sure at first, but once I held up this piece of wood to this knife, I was like, okay, I think this could work out really, really well. I tried some swoopy designs, I tried some other stuff. I think angular facets just is what this blade needs. So I'm splitting the block into two pieces. This front piece that's going to basically be like the front bolster, the back piece, and then in the middle there's going to be a metal spacer. After I cut it, then I go ahead and drill it. I don't have a mill yet at this point. I have one now, but at this point I didn't have a mill, so it's just doing the hard way. Drill some tiny, tiny holes, poke it to the other side, and then you gotta file it. So this part isn't super precise. The nice thing about wood is you don't have to be that precise. If it was a metal piece, then yes, you would have to be more precise. You'd have to get it much tighter, and then you'd have to get it to the point where it's basically like a press fit on there. Otherwise, you'll see the seam. Whereas wood or composite, you don't have to be that tight. Like you got to be tight, but not press fit tight. So I mark out where I need the slot. I drill 2 holes for the ends of the slot. And then I actually flip it over and I drill bigger blind holes almost to the other side. And what this does is it opens up the back of that front bolster piece so that there's less to file later on. The less material you have to work with and the less material that you have to like fuss with getting the fit up, the better. So we only want like a thin web at the very front to fit up. You don't want the entire freaking surface to be contacting the tang. It's just going to be a nightmare to try to get it fit up. So after the back is opened up, now switch back to the small drill bit and then break that webbing. Once the webbing is broken, then it's time to file it. So this drill bit is smaller than the thickness of the tang, but you have to allow yourself some wiggle room because without a mill, it's not going to be super precise. So you make an undersized slot and then you file it to shape. And there's no glamorous way to do this fit up, unless you have a mill, which I didn't. So I just drilled the holes and I'm just filing. It's file, check it, file, check it, file, check it. It's a lot of practice and a lot of pattern recognition to know where to take off material. You can be filing all day long, and then if you take off in the wrong spot, it's not going to get closer, or you can overshoot it, which is horrible. The blade's been etched. Now I think it's time to do the final hand sanding on it. I don't actually want like a black and white super high contrast on this, so I'm going for like a fairly high polished finish, just like a subtle contrast. I'm mainly polishing that bevel to make it shiny for the contrast. I want all of this to be subtle. So like the flat above it, it could have some texture, and then I want that bevel itself to be shiny, smooth, clean. One of the final parts for the blade is to round out and polish up the spine and the choil. And because this spine is curved, I can't just take it to the platen of the belt grinder and round it out that way. I can't think of a good way to evenly round out the whole entire spine. This method actually works really well. You just got to be really careful and have really smooth motions all the way up and down. You don't want to be like jittering too much. Any stops and starts will give you a nice fresh gouge on your nearly finished blade. So I'm going with a really high grit finish, and then once I'm done with that, it'll be basically hand sanding and hand buffing later on. For the handle construction, I've super glued the stainless spacer to the big block of wood, and then I've drilled all the way through down into the handle for the hidden pins. For handles like this, with dissimilar metals in between and stuff like that, it needs alignment pins, otherwise it's going to come apart. Glue can only do so much, especially with dissimilar materials. So when things heat up and cool down over different like environments and temperature changes and stuff like that, it's basically just going to rip apart the joint. I wanted this thing to be like overkill, so these pins are, they're long. They probably don't need to be that long, but I wanted as much rigidity as possible. And I'm actually shaping this handle without the spacer in there. I think I'll explain it a little bit later. Got my lines roughly marked out, and then I just go in and break down the big diagonals, just freehand. Once you establish your center lines and where you need things to be, like this part is actually not too bad. The biggest thing is just knowing where you want to take off material and setting up the foundation beforehand. The center lines are everything. If you don't have the center lines, you're gonna struggle. I'm always checking my work, eyeballing, making sure that things line up in the right places so that all the facets are symmetrical and they're same sizes and whatnot. And then of course I make sure that it feels right. It's still pretty chunky, so I'm just going to keep taking off more and more material. So once the handle is roughly shaped, I take it apart again. I got to be really careful because these pins are tight. And I don't want to break any of those edges. The reason why I'm shaping the stainless spacer separate from the rest of the handle is because when the handle is finished, I want there to be a small chamfer between every edge of the handle fit up. And this is going back to the changes in humidity and temperature and stuff like that when things expand and shrink. Wood expands and shrinks at a much different rate than metal. And if you finish a handle and don't chamfer anything, it's going to feel good at first, and then once you ship it across the world or whatever, or from winter to summer, it's gonna shrink. And the metal is gonna stay proud, and if you finished it really, really crisp, you get a sharp edge between everything. And it's just not comfortable. So I cut the spacer separately, and I'm grinding it almost to the surface of the wood right now. I'm doing it separately like this also because of heat, because steel heats up so fast, and if I just ground all of it together at once, it would be burning like the wood at the same time. It's just, you don't want to do that. So I'm just looking straight down on the grinder, seeing where it's raised, where you've got high spots, and then I just take down those high spots. And then once it's close, I get it flush. So on the disc grinder, I'm just grinding it all the same level. And this is just pure muscle memory. I've just been practicing this for so long, so I can basically almost do this with my eyes closed. The small facets are the scariest because if you slip, you can mess up the lines really, really easily. Just something to be careful of. And then, like I said, with the disc, super nice to bring up the grits, swap out the sandpaper. I think this is like 2,500 grit sandpaper on here right now. So I can take this handle all the way to basically polishing stages on the disc grinder. So I get all the facets nice and crisp and tight, and then I round out the bottom. The bottom always has to be rounded out for comfort. And it looks good, feels good. It's already looking really good, actually. And then I take everything apart. This is why it needs those alignment pins, because it has to be able to come apart and come back together in the same exact place every time. And then in between all the pieces, all those edges, I just break them with a tiny, tiny chamfer so that over time when things shrink and swell, it's a feature. You get a little tiny polished lip instead of a sharp burr. I don't know if there's a better way to do this. This is just the way that I found works well. I'm just using a rubber pad on the table, holding it with my hand, and then just looking at it with my eye to see like the shiny spots and how wide those shiny spots are. And then basically everything's almost done. Handles all together, all glued up. Now it's just sanding and getting all of the scratch patterns the same direction, getting it even, breaking any like critical sharp edges. And we try to take off very, very little material right here, because if you take off too much, then you've just erased those chamfers that took so long to do. And the best part is the final oiling of the handle. This knife took quite a long time, but surprisingly it came together really easily. There's no like real hiccups or mistakes or anything. It just came together really well. This is one of those knives where once it starts coming together and it finishes up, I really love the final product. It's basically everything that I envisioned, and I'm really proud of how it turned out. If you like our videos and you'd like to support us, we have a Patreon and YouTube membership. There are 2 different tiers with a Discord and extra videos. Some of the extra videos include just kind of behind the scenes stuff, tips and tricks, discussions. This week's video is a little tutorial on how we round and polish the spines and choils of our knives.